doesn't need to be stressed here that the city of Assiut was in late antiquity, as it is now, a well-known center, an important city within Egypt. I just for the record, I remind you that the most famous philosopher of late antiquity, Plotinus, was born here in the beginning of the 3rd century. To a certain Alexander of Nicopolis, we owe a famous treatise against the Manichaeans. He probably was Alexander of Nicopolis, a pagan philosopher, but later tradition made him into a bishop. Assiut was home to many martyrs, as you all know. In the 4th century, Milesius of Assiut, of Nicopolis, started the Milesian Schism, an episode of church history that we all know and associate, of course, with St. Athanasius. From the early 7th century, we know the name and some of the works attributed to Constantine of Assiut, who was one of the major bishops in the early Anti-Chalcedonian Church, the forerunner of the present Coptic Orthodox Church. Considering this importance of Assiut, well known to all of you, of course, in late antiquity, it doesn't come as a surprise that Assiut was surrounded in late antiquity by many sanctuaries connected with the cult of the martyrs. Sanctuaries that became centers of pilgrimage in late antiquity, and also by many monasteries. Even today, Assiut, which still is an important Christian center, as we heard yesterday, and it is surrounded by what I call here a crown of monasteries. I show you on the slide on the right-hand side a very bad map, published by, or not published, it is from Jean Dorès' unpublished doctoral dissertation on monasticism in Middle Egypt that has been published only in the 1990s in a manuscript version. And what you can see on the map is actually the density, the concentration of monastic sites around the city of Assiut, ancient Nicopolis. You go from the north, from the region of Abnou, where you have the hanging monastery of St. Menas, via the ancient necropolis and the ancient cemeteries of west of Assiut, to the south, to the region of Shotta, and as you can see on the map, it is not a very clear map, it's not a very good map, but you can see that there's a lot of monastic sites, places called Dayr. So, you might expect a corresponding richness in our documentation. Yet, and that may come as a surprise, Assiut is almost absent from the scholarly discussion, from the scholarly debate about Egyptian Christianity in late antique, early medieval times. It is almost a blank spot on our map of late antique and early medieval Egypt. To quote just one example, when you start to look up Assiut in the well-known and very useful Brussels database of Coptic documentary papyri, the score for Assiut is very meager. There's almost nothing that can be really with some certainty attributed to the immediate region of Assiut. To put it somewhat sharply, many of the monasteries around the city of Assiut profit from an article in the Coptic Encyclopedia, but they hardly contribute to our knowledge of Coptic Egypt. There is a kind of gap here in our knowledge. The explanation for this gap is, well, it's quite obvious. At that time, the region was well, explored by the Egyptologists, archaeologists, or rather, very often, these were people without any proper, well, archaeological training, but undertaking excavations, hunting for pharaonic remains, for the pharaonic antiquities to be found in the region of Assiut, and very often ruining, destroying the traces of later reuse, in particular in this case, of course, reuse in Christian times, destroying the evidence quite frequently without any published record. And in particular, the region of Assiut is famous because it's one of the sources for something that is sacred to Egyptologists. That is the coffin text. You know, that's a corpus of funerary texts of the Kingdom, very famous among Egyptologists. And part of these come from the Assiut, quite a considerable part even, come from the Assiut region. For Coptic antiquities, the result is that many architectural remains have been destroyed without being properly recorded, and that other evidence, apart from some inscriptions, was sold on the antiquities market to join the great mass of objects and documents from the Coptic late antiquity, Christian late antiquity, for which no certain provenance is known. We just heard about the amount of material for which you may suppose that perhaps it stems from Vliet, but we are never sure. This kind of loss of context, of course, makes that these documents, these artifacts, these papyri, whatever they are have become largely worthless for historical research. Historical artifacts without a context are actually, from a scientific, from a scholarly point of view, worthless. Well, I will illustrate this with two examples of sites that for which we have some documentation, and that in recent decades have attracted some scholarly interest. The first of these sites is Dayr al Gabrawi, north of Assiut, actually near Abnou, and the second is the so-called Dayr al which was already mentioned in yesterday's paper by Father Sheridan. First, to Dayr al Gabrawi. Dayr al Gabrawi, once more, is not famous for its Coptic antiquities. It is famous for rock-cut tombs from the Old Kingdom. These rock-cut tombs were published in 1902 by Norman de Garis-Davis. And Norman de Garis-Davis did have some interest in Christian remains, so some inscriptions from these tombs pointing at monastic reuse of the tombs have been recorded. Besides these tombs, I must say there is a later re-edition by Karamati that is exclusively focused on the Old Kingdom reliefs, and is also not much better as an edition of the older one. Besides these tombs, there is a Christian village, which is called the Dayr, which may or may not point at the earlier presence of a monastery. There is a very modern church, and there are lots of remains of presumably late antique date. Among them, what looks like a Roman basilica, and sites locally known as the Chapel of St. Barbara or the Monastery of St. Barbara, names that seem to have very little historical foundation. Fortunately, in the 1980s, some surveys in the region were carried out. The first, I guess, was by, in the any case, the results were published in the early 1990s by Peter Grossman here present, so he can contradict me if I'm wrong. This resulted in an archaeological map of some sort. That's what is here on the right hand side of the slide. Well, this is not actually exactly what I would call a good archaeological map, but I'm not an archaeologist, I should add, but at least it gives some kind of inventarization of archaeological sites near Dayr al Gabrawi. Regrettably, the interpretation of find spots on this map solicited different opinions from the various authors. Some of the interpretations by Peter, proposed by Peter Grossman are different from those proposed by Peter Koert. To know more about this, you should consult the article by Peter Grossman of 1991. So there are some named antique sites, and what you see on the left-hand side of the slide is Peter Grossman's drawing of the remains of a Roman basilica. A Roman basilica, which is not necessarily a church, as you had. The site is redeemed, so to say, by a pre-Christian Latin inscription of great historical interest, also for the Christian history of the region. That is called Seal 3-22, seal that is Corpus Inscriptionum Latinarum, so the corpus, a 19th century big corpus, large books of Latin inscriptions, also from Egypt. The inscription is known since the late 17th century, and it shows the establishment by the Emperor Diocletian of a camp of the first cohort of the Lusitanians built here in Dayr al Gabrawi in the neighborhood of Dayr al Gabrawi in 288 AD. The camp was probably part of a larger military reorganization of the Roman Empire under Diocletian. According to rumor, the inscription should still be built into the walls of the modern church, but I think it hasn't been seen actually by anybody since the middle of the 19th century, but I may be wrong. Peter Grossman will contradict me if I'm wrong. This inscription allows a series of inferences. The first one of this, is that probably around Dayr al Gabrawi we have the camp known as Hierarchon. That's the first inference. The second is that it seems likely that this camp Hierarchon, perhaps to be situated in the region of Dayr al Gabrawi, is to be identified with the Castro Hierakion mentioned in the hagiographical literature about the martyr Saint Victor, the son of Romanus, Saint Victor the General, as the place of his martyrdom and death, but that took place south of Antinopolis. Third inference, that this say, localization of Hierakion near Dayr al Gabrawi would be corroborated by the traditional dedication of the Church of Dayr al Gabrawi to the same Saint Victor the General. Supposing that these assumptions are correct, Dayr al Gabrawi may have housed a major sanctuary of an important Egyptian saint, and Dayr al Gabrawi may offer an interesting example of the Christian reuse of Roman military architecture. Regrettably, too little archaeological work has been done on the various sides of Dayr al Gabrawi to be positive on any of these points. I would suggest that tracing the Latin inscription might be a good starting point for any further research. And I move on. I must say, if you want to read more about this, Jürgen Horn, in several publications of the 1980s and 1990s, published about the matter of the place of the death of Saint Victor the General. We move on to Dayr al It's the monastery of the bones, situated in the western necropolis of Assiut. Once more, one of the places where the, for coven texts, famous among Egyptologists, are supposed to come from. There is has been some recent interest also from the part of Egyptologists in this site and in its Christian remains. The Assiut project, directed by Professor Jacques, published the first volume, Ancient Assiut, in 2007, where he also pays attention to Coptic remains as far as they are still existing. This site was excavated, well, rather it was plundered, looted by two local amateur diggers in September 1897. One was a Muslim, another a Copt, and it was a nice example of interreligious cooperation. In any case, a very brief report of this excavation, doubtful excavation, appeared in 1900. A very schematic map after the Russian scholar Traveller de Bock was published in 1912 by Thomas Clark in his Christian Antiquities, and that's what you see on the slide here. Among the finds that are reported are the remains, tiny remains, I must say, of a medieval monastic library containing 24 fragments of parchment and paper coinages with biblical, apocryphal, homiletic and liturgical text, predominantly in Semitic, some for Arabic. These are unpublished as far as I'm aware, but they are analyzed by Crum in his Coptic Monuments of 1902. And then there's another interesting find, a jar with a long Sahidic inscription of a, we might say, historical nature from the middle of the 12th century. It is dated to AD 1155-56. And also, this is analyzed by Crum in his Coptic monument. The inscription on the jar gives the name of the monastery as this monastery of Abba John of the Desert. The name, Abba John of the Desert, is also found in some other medieval sources. On the basis of its name, this medieval name, Abba John of the Desert, and the position of the monastery, that is located not far west of Assiut, it has been often thought that this Abba John could be the famous monk John of Nicopolis from the late 4th century, about whom we heard the paper by a paper yesterday. Consequently, Dayr al could be the hermitage of St. John of Nicopolis, and among other scholars, Dores and Peter Grossman adhere to this thesis, or at least find it likely. But I should underline that this assumption is not supported by any contemporaneous, that's to say, 4th, 5th century material that can be said, definitely be said, to come from the Renaissance. Yet, this identification of Dayr al with the medieval monastery of Abba John of the Desert with the hermitage of St. John of Nicopolis served as the basis for an interesting hypothesis about which we heard also yesterday already. That was brought forward in 1995 by the papyrologist Constantin Sukerman. In his view, Dayr al the monastery of Abba John of the Desert, could be the provenance of the so-called archive or dossier of Abba John the Angerite, a group of Greek and Coptic papyri consisting of letters addressing a monk, Abba John, who apparently was, living in the end of the 4th, beginning of the 5th century, and was very well connected with the higher society of his time, and who might, as Father Sheridan pointed out yesterday, who might very well be the sort of person John of Nicopolis was. This dossier had apparently appeared on the antiquities market briefly after the amateur diggings by the two local archaeologists I just referred to, after the amateur diggings at Dayr al in 1897. and it soon got dispersed to various mainly British collections. It is commonly associated with the Hermopolite known as, by the way, are many other Middle Egyptian pyramid. The hypothesis of Zuckerman is very attractive. If correct, it at once confirms the connection of John of Nicopolis with Dayr al and provides us with the social network of an important holy man from late antiquity, known from various literary sources as a major figure in early Egyptian monasticism. Yet, the hypothesis is also very fragile. The provenance of the dossier of Abba John in Dayr al is not proven. And even if it were, John is a very common name. And there must have been hundreds of Abba Johns in around the same time. Zuckerman's thesis is accepted by some, but rejected by others, for example, Mohammed Sherwood, who prepares a comprehensive edition of the archive. His arguments are partly of a general nature that I do not find very convincing. His only convincing argument is actually his proposed reconstruction of the provenance of the dossier that might actually have appeared on the market just before the diggings of 1897. In my opinion, Zuckerman's thesis can best be accepted as an attractive working hypothesis that can be falsified, I think, not by reflections of a general nature, but only by a thorough topographical analysis of the dossier of Abba John. Where does this social network fit in topographically? In the Assiut region, or indeed more to the north in the neighborhood of Hermopolis? It's time for my conclusions. The monasteries of Assiut tell actually a sad story of destruction and neglect. Assiut must have been an important Christian center in late antiquity as it was in modern times, But hardly anything survives that can be used to document its history in this period. The connections that have been postulated between Dayr al Gabrawi and the martyr, Saint Victor the General, on the one hand, and between Dayr al and Saint John of Nicopolis, on the other hand, connections that I have briefly discussed here rest on meager evidence and are extremely fragile. Only a combination of further research in the field and in museum and library collections may help us to reconstruct a world that now seems largely lost, the world of Christian Assiut in late antiquity. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. And as we will have time tomorrow, because we will leave after tomorrow, so we will have 5 minutes for questions, and then we will have our break, and then only one contribution, so we will have time for discussion, and then we will have the bus to Duronka. So we have 5 minutes for questions, and then after that we will have half an hour for coffee, and then half an hour and perhaps 10 minutes for your contribution, and then after that we go to the bus.
The name Dayr al. First, I'd like to thank you for that very informative presentation. Dayr al, is it the monastery of the great ones or the monastery of the bows? Because they share the same order.
Yeah, I looked it up. It should be, according to the dictionary, al-Isam, and meaning with boats. So referring to
because al-Azam in Arabic is either the great ones or bones.
well, the creation alongside the boats would be reasonable because it is situated on the ancient metropolis.
Yeah, and we don't have any monastic settlement with the great ones. Something not so usual.
There was Dayr al Gabrawi in the place of the Azhar mosque in Cairo, and because it was when they built the greater Cairo, they moved it to the Amber West, the actual Amber West.
That's another.
Any more questions? Yes,
But
please.
also, in the place of Al-Akbar Mosque in Cairo, there was a place called Dayr al-Azam. So any place they could found some relics or whatever, they
Yeah.
name it al-Azam. So
Okay, thank
it's
you.
common.
Thank you. Yes, it's not.
Any more questions? So we please come back at 11 o'clock to have the break now. Okay, so we have a break till 11